Welcome to the Courier 13 podcast. Our goal with this show is to present conversations among filmmakers that impart knowledge and inspiration to people who are currently making cinematic content, or for those who aspire to make movies and television but don't have the know-how yet to start, or for people who are just fascinated by the filmmaking process and the entertainment industry. Our guest today is television writer and screenwriting professor Rosanne Welch. Okay, we are going. Hey, Rosanne.
Hello.
Nice to meet you again.
It is lovely to meet you. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. I know you were a professor of Daniela's. Is she a good student? I just wanted to
Of course. She showed up all the time, ready to go, and had good notes
Awesome.
to give all the people in her cohort. That's what you need to do.
That's good.
I mean, yeah, it's like, since I feel like writing is such a collaborative thing to do, especially when it was about spec scripts. So, I mean, I only wanted to give like the feedback that I wanted to get back. And even if I didn't get enough feedback from, other kids that were there as well. But I watched the majority of the shows that everyone was writing about. So it was easy to give feedback. But yeah, it was exciting. It was exciting.
That's half the job, I always tell people, you get hired to write on a television show. Look at them. They have 8 episodes now, or 12 maybe. You're going to write 1, and you're going to have to give good notes on the other 10 or 11 for people who want you to stick around. It's your job to make their work better so the show doesn't get canceled and you'll keep your job. So notes are one of the most important things to understand how to do.
And you're talking from the perspective of if you're like staff on a show.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, because I know that I did some research into your career and your experience. You've written a lot for television. I mean, you've written for a couple of shows, so you understand that world very well.
I did live in several writers' rooms, both as an assistant before I was a full-time writer and then as a writer. So I saw it in both ways, through both perspectives.
How are those perspectives different?
Well, when you're an assistant, of course, you're very wrapped up in, I've got to get down everything they're saying and make sure we know who told the funny joke or whose idea was the one we went forward with. And you're very focused, but you're also listening to how they banter ideas about and who gets paid attention to and how you learn how to run a room. And it doesn't just mean when you become the showrunner, you're going to run the room, but when you're pitching an idea, you are truly performing and making sure the other people in the room are focusing in on you. So I got to watch different people do that in their own different way. And probably the best thing I learned was that everybody has their own different way. You can't try and copy somebody else, or it's just like a bad TV show that's a ripoff of a ripoff of a ripoff. You know it, and doesn't have any emotion or passion to it. So it was really important to learn that you've got to do it your way, and you've got to get better at it. You can't be that shy person in the corner waiting for someone to offer you a turn. That's never going to happen, because a room full of writers is a room full of performers, and they're all wanting to tell you their story. So they're not going to turn around and say, and what will you think about that? So you have to be comfortable doing that. So it was a really good lesson. I really say, of course, that is the jumping off job for television writers. You need to get a job as an assistant, because you need to study that little world before you dive into it, because then you won't know the people management part of it. You might be a really good writer, and that happens to a lot of people. But if you can't manage the people aspect, you're not going to be successful in the writer's room.
Right. Because it's a bunch of, everyone's a little different in how they pitch and how they present their stuff. And it really, I mean, is the most important aspect of it who is able to communicate their thoughts the best to the showrunner or the head writer?
Yes, that's exactly right. The first job you have to do in any new show, of course, every new show, unless it's someone you've worked with before, and that can happen, but not always, right? Sometimes your friends don't get other jobs, and so you move in with somebody else, kind of. You have to understand them first. First, you have to understand their show and what do they think the show is. I give a classic example that most people have heard of, or at least seen some of The Sopranos. And the joke about The Sopranos was they described the show as a family drama where dad happens to be a hitman. So if you were pitching an idea, you weren't pitching a crime. You were pitching, mom and dad had a fight and I'm afraid they're getting divorced. So I'm going to pretend to be sick to draw mommy and daddy together. And while I'm doing that, daddy gets busy having to kill someone and I don't get his attention, right? Always the dad story with that crime was a secondary thing. And if you didn't understand that, you would pitch the incorrect kind of stories and you'd never win, right? So first you have to understand what the person thinks their show is. And then you have to understand them. What do they like? How do they want to hear things? What kind of personalities do they like? You can't really change yourself, but you can readjust some things when you see how the rhythm is of what they like to do. And actually, one of my favorite stories is you also can cheat, because I recognized early on in a particular show that there was a gentleman who didn't like other people to win. And so when you started to pitch, you would find ways to tear it apart before the boss could say yes. Once you got the yes, he would be on board because he wasn't going to go against what the boss said. So a joke I often tell students and friends is I had an idea I wanted to pitch, and I didn't want to do it in front of that person being in the room. So I waited until the boss, who happened to be another female, went to the bathroom. And I pitched it over washing our hands at the sinks. And by the time we got back to the room, she liked it enough that she started with, Rosanne had this great idea. We should talk it through. And I saw the guy's eyes across the table, and I saw that he wanted to say something, and he stopped. And then I got the script because I sold it away from him. So,
Wow.
You have to think about things like that.
It's kind of like you have to play the game of chess when it comes to something like that, like you have to, okay, like he's doing this, but you have to like think a way to get around him. So you kind of like, I kind of knew where the story was going when you said, I expected you to go behind his back, which is, something so common that everyone does in this industry, I feel like. So
it's strategy. You're right in comparing it to trend.
Well,
it's just
politics.
The people are the players. It's politics. Yes. That is exactly right. And it's not that he wasn't, a perfectly fine guy, and he wrote some lovely things, and he could be very useful in a room once the idea had been approved. But yeah, you learn those things quick, or you don't sell the next script.
Do you always have to strategize that way? Because I think a lot of people who want to be in writers' rooms almost don't even take that into account. That's almost something you learn on the job.
Which is why being an assistant first is a good thing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's that assistantship, I guess. I'm sorry, messed up that word. But it's that job that's why, I think that's why that's so helpful, because you can't play in the writer's room unless you know the game, in a sense.
Yes, exactly. That's a beautiful metaphor too, right? You're not going to go onto a basketball court and try to play football. You need to understand the rules of the game.
How would you pitch to a showrunner who seemed deflective towards your ideas? Or I know that's a loaded question.
No, that's an excellent question. That can happen because relationships grow and change. People get mad at each other for some reason. Maybe other people poison someone's attitude about somebody else on the show simply because they want to get rid of them because they're competition. It doesn't always happen. I've worked for some lovely people for whom I had a marvelous time and who were very supportive and wanted to help new writers moving up. And they really were. There's some wonderful people in this town. I really say the problem is we hear more of the bad stories than the good ones. But yes, in case such a thing happens, I think you should take a psychology class, frankly. I think everyone should take a psychology class to understand the personalities out there. And then you have to find your ways around that. When I felt like there might be someone getting in my way, I figured out who my allies were, and you made sure to connect with them. At certain points, there were things I wanted to change in a script, and I knew a person at the table would argue against it. So I went privately to a different producer on the show who I knew I actually did get along with well, and explained why I didn't like something. And he was like, he had to agree with me first, right? Or he wouldn't help. He agreed with my point of view. And so he knew he could present that in the room because he had a higher title than I did at the time. And so he did. And when he presented it, it got accepted. So I went sideways to get my idea move forward. So, you find ways.
Mm-hmm. This might be a really sad thing to say, but do you think sometimes it's not always the best writers who get their pitches up, but it's the people who can work with the room and by either maneuvering around can get their stuff into the ears of the right people and then present that?
That is very true. I wouldn't say, you have to be a good writer to get in the room in the first place. Sure, or they wouldn't have hired you across all those stacks, since you've seen all the things you've read from him.
Right. Yeah, no. There's a lot of crap to filter through. Absolutely.
Exactly. So generally speaking, you had to be at a certain level to get in the room. But yeah, then it's the people who can work. You have to work both things. A friend of mine is fond of saying it's called show business, not show art. So business is half of the job. And you really need to understand how the business works, not just the people management then, but now move up to understanding how the network makes their decisions and how do you sell things to them. I've had show running friends who will tell stories about how there were moments they wanted in a script and they knew the network wouldn't like those moments. Maybe they're pushing the envelope on something. So they put in a couple of worse moments, knowing that when the network said, oh, you can't do that, or that, they'd go, I hear what you're saying. I understand. I won't do that or that, but I've got to have this. And they'd get the one thing they really wanted. So they were playing a little chess game as well. All right. So at every level, there's an understanding of what do people need? How do I give them what I want and still what they need at the same time?
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, out of, I saw, you mentioned it in class a couple of times, like the shows that you've worked on and everything. But in Beverly Hills, was that like Beverly Hills 90210, like the 80s version, not the newer version that came out
the 90s version.
2010.
The
90s. The 90s.
The 90s.
Version. Yeah,
version.
The 90s. Would you say that, were you a writer or were you a writer's assistant in that?
I was a freelance writer on that. That was my very first script.
Okay.
And so I was a freelance writer.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did you feel when you got like the chance?
That's wonderful stuff. It's wonderful stuff. It was because at the time I had a partner and she was the assistant to the executive producer of that show. So after reading 4 spec scripts of ours, he finally agreed to let us pitch. And so we came in and pitched, and that was lovely. So she was much more comfortable in that room than I was because she knew everybody. She'd been there for 2 or 3 years at that point. But, I knew the gentleman in charge, Chuck Rosen, was one of the quote unquote good guys in town, a sweetheart. He'd been on a show called Northern Exposure, which I adored. He's an excellent writer, and cared about the stories. And I always say Beverly Hills 90210 is an excellent study for people in who the showrunner is makes a difference. Because that show was created as a pilot by Darren Star, who's still famously writing pilots. And then he left, and the show was managed on a daily basis by Chuck Rosen. If you look at the pilot of 90210, it's really a bunch of rich kids in fancy clothes hanging out at the beach having bonfires. There's not a whole lot of meat to it. 2 Ohio kids' dad moves to town because he's an accountant and he's going to work in Beverly Hills. And so their Midwest values meet Beverly Hills values. And that's all you get. Chuck took over, and he was the child of a surgeon at Cedars-Sinai. He grew up in Beverly Hills. So those children became real 3-dimensional human beings. Because one of the issues is how do you connect to a character that's uber rich? Like they have no problems because they're rich. And that's what most people would think because we're not all rich. But he knew kids who had drug problems. He knew kids whose parents had drug problems and therefore weren't there for them. So he looked at the fact that it doesn't matter how much money you have. If there's a problem in your family, it still makes you vulnerable. And that is going to make an audience interested in you. So those characters became 3-dimensional human beings for the 5 years he ran the show. And then he left, and a couple of people who mostly worked in more soap opera kind of things. And I like soap operas. I don't think they're bad, but they're a different style. And they turned the show into who was having sex with who each week. But it stayed on the air for another 3 or 4 years because of the foundation, the love for those original characters that the audience had. They just kept wanting to watch them, even if the stories got less and less interesting. And that's the power of what he put together in those first 2 years. So truly believing and caring about those characters, which meant he truly believed and cared about the writing. The stories had to be real. And I think that showed. That's why, I mean, come on, why you guys still know what Beverly Hills 90210 is? You weren't around in the 90s, right? But it's been around and rerun. There's a lot of other teenage shows, but that one sticks, right? There's a reason for that.
Well, and then there's a reason why it was rebooted, because there's just, well, at least people back then still love it and still may want to watch the reboot, but also it's like the characters that they're based on is still, they still have legs. Like there's something about them that you can continue with or revamp. You know, I mean, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of like reboots and just reboots,
Right?
but if you're gonna do it, then you know you want to make characters that had a foundation back then.
Right.
How many seasons did that show, the original show, remind me? How many seasons did that go for?
I believe 9 or 10. I'd have to double check myself. I didn't stay on it, only did the freelance episode, but it was on for, he did 5 years, and I believe the next set of producers did at least 4.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
they put the kids through college basically.
did Chuck start it, or did he come on?
He came on right after the pilot. When the pilot was made, you do a pilot and you wait for the network to say if they're going to run it or not. And they did. And I don't remember if it's because Darren Star was busy or Aaron Spelling, who was the production company, didn't want him. I don't remember, but they hired Chuck right off of Northern Exposure. And so he, from episode 2 on, was the person behind the growth of those characters.
Was Chuck a great people's person? Do you think that's why he was so effective as in his position?
Yes, he loved people. He loved writers. He was very progressive. I mean, we are talking about the 90s, but if you look again at some of the storylines they covered, he was really doing a lot of things on TV that hadn't been addressed necessarily, and certainly not in the teenage world yet. He took them seriously, and he was really good at stacking his writer's room with people who were good writers. I mean, they all went off and did really cool other things. So he had a good eye for talent, I would say.
I'm just thinking when you were talking about like teenagers, seeing those stories, because I mean, you even see it today with shows like Euphoria on HBO,
Right.
like these kids that have drug problems, that have identity issues, gender identification problems. Like there's always, but they're not poor. Like you don't need to like have these children be in these dire straits for you to feel something for them, because we all know someone or are currently dealing through addiction or something. And that, I mean, I feel like 90210 kind of, you can even say that the legacy lasts even in that way. People
I think that's
still
true.
feel comfortable to do those kind of stories.
If you go pre-90210, you're going to find that teenagers were more often in comedies and more often in kind of doing silly things and very superficial things, getting a date, things like that. And from 90210 on, they had real lives and real things could happen to them and real problems happen to them. And as you said, continue through Euphoria. Exactly. You don't do a teen show these days that doesn't look at their lives more in depth, I guess is what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
You like, and you also can tell like the difference a little bit. Like Gossip Girl, with the original, like I know the reboot is coming out and it seems, like Gossip Girl back then, it used to have, it shows like the problems of like the Upper East Siders of New York, but it also includes the problems of like Dan Humphrey. And he's like lonely boy. They hashtag him like lonely boy because he's always alone. He's kind of a like the outsider coming in. And it kind of like, I don't know if I don't see it as relatable as 90210, because I feel like 90210 did establish more things with like drug addictions and all that. And I haven't watched Gossip Girl like recently, but I don't know if I think Chuck was the one that had problems with like drugs or something. But I feel like Gossip Girl had more elaborate problems that wouldn't really happen to like kids our age, like Serena getting involved with that the guy who was running for like senator of New York, like Nate's cousin or something like that. That doesn't really happen. Like, I mean, it probably does happen, but it's not something very relatable.
Yeah, it's and that's the thing, because Hollywood and the industry will find a certain approach into a story and an approach to characters, and they'll be like, okay, let's keep doing that until people can't deal with it anymore. And then you get, I'm not trying to trash on like Gossip Girl or that show, but they're trying to do kind of that similar approach into a teenager's lives, but of course, to make it different, they have to up they got to up the problems. They got we have to make these problems, and you'll see that a lot with shows that feel like other shows.
That's very true.
They'll take the same approach, but they're like, okay, we got to make this bigger because it can't. We have to continue to evolve. And I don't know how you feel about this, Roseanne, but like, do you think that's a problem with a lot of shows in general, that they try to take an approach and just make it more like, and it gets too outlandish that you don't even believe it at a certain point?
I think that is one of the words that everyone is tired of hearing around town is, can it be edgier? Show me something I haven't seen, when in fact, what really works is to watch people you care about go through believable situations and come out on the other side, find their way through it. That's kind of what people look for when they're watching a drama, particularly. You want to see that other people have survived things that might be in your world, as you said before, people, that we have in our families with addiction or issues of other kinds, people going through divorces. That's a very dramatic thing for a teenager to see happen to their parents, even for someone in their 20s. I had a friend who, her and her husband knew from the time their kid was about 12 they were going to get divorced, but they made the assumption that it would be bad to have divorced parents in high school, so they made a deal they'd wait till the kid was 18 and graduated. So here's a kid who thought his family was perfectly normal, and then hey, graduate from high school,
sad.
Daddy and I are breaking up, and it was like, so everything you believe to be true is all blown up. So that's a legitimate experience for someone, and I think if you just go deeper into those experiences and how people manage, that's much more dramatic and interesting than, oh my gosh, my daughter's having an affair with a senator, and now his chief of staff is sending a hitman to kill her so that it won't ruin his political campaign. No, let me just see a kid get through his parents being divorced, because that's really tough, and that's going to connect me to that person for a long time.
Is there a show on today that you think is really good at capturing those really human moments? And I mean, is there a show that you adore that does that accomplishes that well?
I watch such a wide variety of TV. I must say, what I love for y'all's generation is the existence of Netflix. Means that you can watch television from a variety of different countries, beyond which all the various things being made here. And of course, between cable and streaming and whatnot, we laugh now, there's something like 420 new shows out in the world. So it's almost impossible to keep track of all of them. I learn so much when students come in and want to pitch a show I've never heard of, then I have to go watch it and figure out what's going on with this, right? So I watch such a variety of things. It's hard to say. I've been watching a lot of stuff out of New Zealand, and I'm a huge Doctor Who fan. And any kind of science fiction is fun because it is looking at modern day problems, but in that science fiction world. So it's kind of fun to watch and go, oh, this is a problem they're dealing with, but it's happening to aliens instead of, humans or something. So it depends what I watch. I watch a lot of Australian TV, a lot of English TV, a lot of the kind of murder mysteries they do where it's not all about the gore. It's not about CSI, where's all the blood and all the stuff I have to put under microscopes. It's about, again, people. And how come that person seems guilty, but no, and it turns out the red herring is that it's because they knew they were having an affair, but they're not the one who killed him. So it's like puzzles. And I find that really interesting. And I find they can make more real people in shows like that. Sadly, in terms of when I think about, American TV.
Yeah, it seems like you're not that engrossed in American television, which I mean, I do understand on a level.
I agree. Now, there was a great show like 2 years ago now, which got canceled too soon, called Stumptown. And it was the story of a woman who became a detective because she kind of couldn't do anything else very well. And she lived in Portland where there were reservations and Native American casinos. And so she was sort of working in that world. She had a friend who ran a bar who was a former convict. So that was an interesting characterization. And they made a deal right away that they would never have a love relationship. They were just going to be friends. And so that was lovely to watch. And that was really good because it was about real people going through problems. And actually, I'll tell you what, it's actually not an American show, but it aired on the Sci-Fi Channel. It's from Canada. It was Winona Earp, which just wrapped up after 4.5 seasons. And I love that. It was the story, it's science fiction, of course. Winona Earp is the great granddaughter of Wyatt Earp of the OK Corral, the gunfight and Tombstone and all that stuff. And in their envisioning, it's based on comic book. The first person in every generation after Wyatt Earp is gifted this gun called the Peacemaker. And all the people that Wyatt Earp killed in his life come back to life as ghosts. And the only thing that will kill them is this gun. And so you're stuck with the job of fixing the mistakes he made in the past, this guy you never met. And it was really well done because you're watching her go through this obligation. So a little coverage of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you're born in this generation to take care of this problem. But she had much more problems. She was a drunk and all those things. And she was working through that. But what worked, well, many things worked about the show. One of which was her sister was a lesbian, and she and the female sheriff in town had a relationship. And Emily Andress, who produced this show in Canada, knew the trope of killing your gays. And she made a promise up front that neither of these women would ever die. And sure enough, by the time you get to the end of the 4th season, the last episode is their wedding, which is really quite beautiful after you've watched the characters, across 4 years. But the fact that she did that to counter this negative thing that had been happening on TV. And because you knew that, the fun was in always getting one of those two women into a terrible situation that they should have died. And you knew they were going to have to work their way out of it. And so often you would say, oh, don't tell me how something's going to end because I need the tension of worrying. Mm-hmm. I didn't have to worry about them dying, but I had to wonder. So it's worry and wonder are the two most important things for an audience that pulls them through a show. I had to wonder how they'd get out of it. So it still worked. And I thought that was quite brilliant. So I think that's a really good show. And people would probably think it's an American show because it was on American TV as well.
What was that other show that you also mentioned in class? It was about the detective, and then they had to do they kind of did a I don't know if it was also it was a Canadian show as well.
Was it the Murdoch Mysteries, the one about the
I think
the cops?
so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Canada's got some interesting TV, interesting business there too. It's called Murdoch Mysteries. It's on Netflix, a few seasons. It's run 10 seasons. It's about a constable, was what they call their police in Canada, in the turn of the century, 1900. So you're getting a period piece, and his girlfriend, who becomes his wife later on, is the coroner, because she was a rich woman who learned to be a doctor, but nobody will trust you to be a doctor. So she basically cuts up cadavers and helps solve crimes. And what they did beautifully is they're very interesting little, detective stories. But they have a lovely cast of surrounding characters, and eventually they married these two people. And in the States, if you marry characters, the show's over. Right? Bones, they got married, show's done. Castle, they got married, show's done. We don't understand that the day after you get married, that's when the story starts.
Yeah, there's this trope that you marriage and then that's the end game. The end game was getting married, but there's nothing after that. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas they've been, I think, married for 4 or 5 seasons now, and they're perfectly interesting and fun and work together.
Marriages are hard.
They are.
Marriages are not easy, so a bunch of conflict is.
But we don't show that. Somehow it's something outside of the mythology in the United States. That's the end goal, and then we're all done. Or we think it's boring after that. And just like I was saying about a writer's room, what is a marriage except people managing another human being for hopefully the rest of your life, right? So it's very not boring.
See the difference in Mexican TV shows or movies and then the shows that come out in Spain. It's the TV shows that come out in Spain, they're so much more engaging. One that came out recently on Netflix was The Innocent. I don't know if you guys had seen it, but it was number 1 in the charts for Netflix for like a whole week. So it did pretty well. But then you see
what it was
shows. There's
about?
like yes, I watched
it
it.
about?
It was so good. So it was basically this guy. He's a kind of, it starts off with like he's at a party, he's at a concert with his brother, and he starts like, you know, dancing with this other girl, and the guy who she was talking with before obviously gets jealous because the guy who she's talking with now is 100 times more attractive than the guy who was talking to her before. So you know, they start like, the guy goes to the brother of the guy who's like really attractive. I'm gonna call him Mario Casas because that's his name. So just so you guys don't get confused.
Okay.
But so basically, Mario's brother, he starts like, you know, they start like obviously fighting with this guy, and like obviously like the guy that's jealous, he starts punching and like all that stuff. So, and then Mario starts getting, you know, like, stop fighting, like you guys don't need to fight or whatever. But then one of the other guys coming out of the bar, he pushes him into the fight, and then he obviously he also starts fighting. And then what happens after, he kind of goes, he starts fighting this guy, and you know, he didn't want to like hurt him or anything, so he kind of like pushed him back. The guy trips over like a little like a step on the sidewalk, and you know where like in Spain they have like where you put your bikes, those are made out of stone. He hits his head and he dies. So his life, therefore, he's in college, it ends. So he goes to sorry,
Whoa,
he goes to jail. But he goes to jail, so he's there like the majority of the time. Meanwhile, his brother builds a law firm, and he gets married, he has 2 kids, and then on the day that he comes out, like, you know, they have like this thing where they can like 1 day of leave, you know, for like jail. They have like
Out of
1
prison?
free day.
You can leave the prison for a day. Really?
I guess so. I guess
That's
that's
a
how they do
thing?
it in Spain. Yeah.
Alright,
I mean,
okay.
If you probably earn, if you enough good behavior, maybe you earn that sort of thing. Probably still monitored in some way.
Right. I would hope.
We imagine.
I mean, I think they had he was with his brothers, but he had to go back within like, you know, just like 1 day, 1 night. That's it. So he had to go back to jail the next day. But he meets a girl, and you know, they say like, oh, let's meet for a date next morning, or like, you know, in the morning. He makes that promise knowing that he won't go. And it's from there, I don't want to spoil it for you guys if you guys are going to watch it, but all the stories are so linked together, and it's like a twist and turn. They do a really good job of like holding the tension for you to keep watching on to the next episode. And I think that's really well done. Yeah. So
we used to think when streaming came along that wouldn't be as important, because the idea of leaving a show with a bit of a cliffhanger was so you wait a week and you'd remember to come back the next Thursday at 9:00 or whatever that was. And then we're like, oh, streaming, you just binge right through it. You don't need it. But of course, Netflix will say, no. Now we need what they'll call the bingeability factor. Oh, yeah, we need you to see the thing that says next episode and click that right away. We want you to watch 5 in a row. That's just as important as coming back next week. And I think that's really a funny, we thought there was a change there, and it turned out not to be necessary at all.
Yeah, just because it's on this platform where you can binge it doesn't mean that people will automatically just go to the next episode if you don't make it enticing for them to do so. Like, I mean, I've watched a lot. I've started a lot of shows on Netflix, and I did move on to the next. I was just like, you didn't catch me. I don't see the reason. And I think it's like with television writing, because I mean, I write television pilots, and that's my trajectory. I feel like a lot of people just mess up on making the inner conflict of the character that needs to, or the set of characters that needs to be resolved, interesting enough for me to watch an entire season of them trying to figure it out, solve it, / come to terms with it.
Right. And that's your job. Your job is to, the difference in TV, obviously, than movies. Movies, you're going to tell me the most interesting 2 hours in someone's life. What are the most crazy, interesting 2 hours? And we're done. Maybe there'll be sequels, of course, blah, blah, blah. But in general, that's what you're going for. And a TV show, especially a pilot, you need to give me enough fodder to understand that there are at least 20, nowadays with streaming 40, used to be 100 in order to get the syndication, but that there's that much interesting embedded conflict among this group of people that I'm going to be constantly interested in watching them overcome whatever their problem might be, whatever their issue might be. So every show has what we would call an overarching dramatic question that is trying to be answered. So and it should be, the bigger it is, the more universal. So for me, an easy example is Bones, right? Which some people realize was, she's uber smart and autistic, and he's uber Catholic and, goes for the emotion, which of course is a flip to what we think gender wise. It should be the dude being super logical and the girl being super emotional, but they flipped it. So that's interesting. But really it's a show about science versus religion. And the two characters represent those 2 points of view. And there's never going to be an answer to that question, except if you accept that the answer is you need them both. And that's how they solve their crimes. The two of them together are better than each separately. So your overarching question every week is being addressed. The individual question each week is simply, who committed this murder? That's always going to be solved. But the overarching dramatic question can never be solved, or your show's over.
Right. Yeah. Because when you're writing an episode of television, you're always, I think that's good to frame it like there's two questions.
Mm-hmm.
There's the question of the individual episode, like how does this plot build the story? How does it develop the characters? And then you always have to think about, okay, now how is this developing the season? So it almost feels like two separate things that you're working on at the same time.
You are. Exactly.
The here and now, and then the general, which you are kind of doing in a movie, but not in.
But you're going to solve them both at the end of your 2 hours. They're both done.
Right. At the end of your sitting, they're done. Right. But that's not the case with television.
Because why else would you come back the next week?
Right.
You solved the problem. You solved the murder. I got to come back as the detective or the cops or whoever the characters are, or if it's a medical show, they saved this person's life, but what are they going to do next week when they're confronted with another challenge? They have their own personal problems that their job is helping them work through, and that can't be solved.
Well, it can't be solved in one episode, and probably will never be solved, or it'll take forever to solve it, and that's what makes a good television show. A problem, I mean, you can take Breaking Bad, for example, Walter White, his problem of providing for his family and thus becoming a drug kingpin, which ramps up his ego. All of these things combined are inner problems and inner conflicts that don't take you a day.
No, not at all. Exactly.
And you can't do it in a season.
They also had to ramp up, because when they bring you in the beginning, it's, he's going to die of cancer and he needs to make this money, so you feel bad for him. And then the cancer is in remission. So he should stop doing illegal things, except now he's hooked on them.
Right.
He's addicted to the power. Yeah. And now, so that changes who he is in a bad way. But now you've come to like the guy. So you're kind of like, is he going to save himself or not? Right. And kind of not. But yeah, you don't know until you get to the end. Yeah. Oh, exactly. That's a good example.
Kind of also, do you guys, drifting away kind of a little bit from the topic, but do you guys also sometimes find yourself watching a TV show and then they do something different, and then you think to yourself oh, if they did this differently, then it would have been much better, or a much better end result.
All the time.
I watch so many TV shows, and they in terms of mystery or something like that, and they reveal something too quickly, and then it's it takes away the interest that you had until watching the end of the show. So and I feel The Little Things, the movie that came out in HBO with Rami Malek and Jared Leto.
Yes.
I was hoping to find out who the killer was, but they didn't. When Rami Malek kills Jared Leto's character, it kind of
I don't think I've
Was
saw
it was it called The Little Things?
Yeah, it just came out on
HBO.
Netflix or HBO. Sorry, just a
Yeah,
little
on
bit ago.
HBO Max.
Brand
Yeah.
new. So again, you can't keep up with 420 TV shows.
No, you can't.
Nope.
Yeah.
That's why buzz and word of mouth is now one of the most important things. It kind of always was, but when there were only 3 or 4 channels or even 50 cable channels, you found things that people gelled around, and then it became a big event like Mad Men or something like that, or Breaking Bad. Now it really becomes your little circle of friends. You recommend a show, I watch it, I tell somebody else I know outside of that circle, they might tell their group. That is become such an important sort of Venn diagram. Who's seen this and who's seen that? And if you like this, you'll like that. And that's where we get our information from. So it's really important conversation for people to have for the benefit of the programs to get their audiences.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know who said this, but it points to exactly what you just said, Roseanne. It's like no longer are, or at least it's gonna be much less likely that there will be shows like a Seinfeld or a Breaking Bad that like just has this wide audience and everyone's like talking about it. Now it's like good shows will like have their sects of
Mhm.
the public, and
Mhm.
like you're just kind of gonna have to find that sect of the public that, and again, word of mouth has a huge component of that. But that's kind of sad to me because I love the fact that television, I think it still has this capacity, or at least back even just recently had this capacity to really bring people together, like make TV shows like an event. Like, oh my God, you see the last Game of Thrones episode?
Mhm.
Oh my God, and they killed that guy and they made that twist, and that was so one of the things I love about television, but I don't know of how much of that you'll get with all of the outlets that we have.
There is still, for instance, Bridgerton came out of the blue and took everybody by surprise. It was like, oh my God, Bridgerton! Oh my God, did you see Bridgerton? Everybody's talking about it, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it had a little bit of a built-in audience because it's based on a book series, so that's why all the streamers and the networks, they're desperate to take IP, intellectual property, because you bring in an audience. And then they're just going to amplify that audience by making the film version of it, the TV version of it, the limited series version of it, and then they're going to build and build, right? So they're really interested in that. And Bridgerton was a good example of how that works. And then they added the Shonda Rhimes sort of gloss to it. And suddenly I had never heard of the book series. I'd never read the book series. I didn't know it existed, but I certainly knew Bridgerton existed. And then I had to watch it because 3 or 4 people, and I'm not necessarily a fan of those kinds of romance dramas, but everybody said, you got to watch this. So I gave it a shot. I gave it a first episode. I always try to give things a first episode, as we were saying before. And if it connects, I'll go to the next one, right? Sometimes, even if the first doesn't work, I'll give it a second one. Because what I do know is when you're making a pilot, you've gotten so many notes from the network and the production company, and you've had to dance for so many people to make sure they're all keep saying yes to you, that it's not necessarily exactly what you originally wanted to do. But once they say yes and you get on the air, the next episode is going to look more like what you've always wanted. So if it works on the second one, then I'll stick with it. If I don't get it on the second one, then I stop watching.
So it's like a pilot is like, do most production companies, most executives, once the pilot is out there and people respond to it, do they normally just kind of back up after that? They're like, okay, it seems like you've got a show on your hands. We'll let you do it the way you want to do it.
It depends on your relationship with the network. Obviously, the kinds of people like Shonda Rhimes, as I mentioned, someone who's got a track record like that can say, I know what I'm doing, leave me alone. Netflix basically promises that. That's how they wooed people away from broadcast and cable. They're like, we promise not to give you notes. Just whatever you like to do, you go do it, and yay for you, right? So Ryan Murphy's doing Pose and things like that. They're not going to give a ton of notes. If you're new, they might still, because they're trying to form what is going to be a sort of a Netflix brand. If you're new in the network world or the cable world, yeah, you'll get that kind of stuff for a little bit until you have a track record and can say, I don't, or you'll still get notes, but you have much more ability to say, no, can't do that. That changes the trajectory of the show, or that's wrong for my character, or whatever those things are. And that's part of what I was saying about earlier. You learn how to manage notes. You learn how to say, all right, I'll give you this, but I'm keeping that. Or we're going to do this because we want this kind of an episode. And if you don't like it, that's too bad. next week we'll do this kind of episode, which will, smooth down some feathers if people have a problem with whatever storyline we gave last week. So your ability to be more autonomous grows as your career grows.
Was there a specific instance where you had written an episode of a television show and the network came and was like, we don't like this, we don't like this, we don't like this, and you had to be like, no? And how did you do that? How did you go about no?
That actually happened in my second episode. Was a show called Picket Fences, which was by David E. Kelly, who'd come off of LA Law, and he's done a million things since then. Quite brilliant. He wasn't there anymore. He left the show to another producer named Jeff Melvoin, who's quite another wonderful producer in town, writer producer, and he got Emmys and whatnot. It's brilliant. But came in to do that, and it was a show about a small town America. Dad was a cop, sheriff, and mom was a doctor. So you kind of had the mix of cop and doctor shows all in one. You could decide what the episode would be, and I thought that was brilliant. And they had 3 kids, right? They lived in the small town. And we had done, I was still a partner then, we did an episode where the younger boy, who's about 10ish or 11, wanted to be popular in school. And we were looking at the internet and wanting to say the good and the bad. So overarching dramatic question, is the internet a good influence or bad influence? And of course, there's much good about it. You can watch all kinds of educational things. You can be exposed to all kinds of things from the past that we didn't know about. We can learn so much more about history, other countries, like I just said about Netflix shows, all of that. But we wanted to balance that with, okay, what are the problems? And so the idea was that the little boy would want to be popular in school, and he would stumble on some internet pornography and print it and hand it around at school so the bigger boys would think he was cool. And then, of course, he would have to pay the price for that. He'd get suspended for a couple of days. His parents would be upset. We'd have to talk about the problem with pornography and what it does to the way people think about women and all that. And the network came back and said they thought it would be more engaging if the little boy didn't copy what he found on the internet, but he created his own. And I about wanted to go kill myself, because I did not believe in that family, that boy would ever have that inclination. But I wasn't running the show. I was just selling an episode then. And the executive producer, Jeff, did argue and argue and argue. And that one we didn't win. So in that episode, the boy actually takes a picture of someone who's naked on the internet and puts his teacher's face on it, and it's like, ooh, look, he photoshopped it before there was even Photoshop, I think. And I hated that so much, but I didn't have any control to change it. So you just had to go with it and make sure that the ending, there was a big discussion about how and why that was wrong and how depressed the father was that his son would behave in that fashion. It really showed that there wasn't anything cool or wonderful about what he had done. So we had to sort of overwrite the ending to make up for a beginning that we didn't appreciate. But, it was there. They had enough. It was only the 3rd season of that show, so they still had the chance to say no. And they often did. Controversy
what show was
scares,
this?
Called Picket Fences.
Oh, Picket Fences. Okay.
Yeah. Now, controversy scares broadcasters because, of course, the word broad means they need the biggest audience possible because they're selling advertising time and promising the biggest eyeballs on your ads. So if you do something controversial, they'll get less viewers, and then the ad people will want to pay them less. So they have a bigger obligation to make the advertisers to not scare the audience away, which is why you get stuff that's much more progressive on cable and then eventually in streaming.
I think Shonda Rhimes does a really good job at doing controversy because, and it's also kind of funny because I remember before Bridgerton, when I was still in high school, she made a show of Romeo and Juliet, but that one did really bad. So I was already skeptical about Bridgerton because that period piece was so bad. But when I watched Bridgerton, I obviously fell in love with it because it did a really good job of engaging me. She did a really good job of engaging me in the show. But I think she knew that she was going to get controversy over the fact that the Duke is African American, and there's the Queen is African American, right? And there's so many African American people that are with money in the show. Well, back then, historically, it wasn't like that. you know,
Well, it's a
or
combination.
maybe there was, but we just didn't really hear about them.
That's part of it, right? The history doesn't report it. I just read the other day, Queen Charlotte was so popular, they're doing a prequel about Queen Charlotte's life, because she is reportedly to be the first queen who was a woman of color in England, but it wasn't widely known, right? So that's a piece of history to go back into and really dig through, and we'll see where that goes. I don't know, I just read this the other day, but that's another example of, wow, that was so popular. Now the Netflix is like, how can I mine this more? They already know they're going to do 7 more limited series, because each of the children in the Bridgerton family is going to have their own 6-hour love story, right? Those are what all the books are. So each book is going to have its own limited series. And they're like, but how else can we mine this intellectual property? Oh, let's go backwards and do a prequel on this character who's not part of the other books, but we'll do, so that'll be whatever they discover, both historically and then whatever fictional thing they lay on top of that.
And I think it also, the prequel is also going to include like the Daphne's mom. And,
probably, yes.
The lady who helped like the Duke get with Daphne.
His guardian, basically. Yeah, his mother's friend. Yeah. So fascinating. But you're right. And what's interesting is you just hit on the fact that here's Shonda Rhimes, who almost always has a hit, but not always, because it's not science, right? You can't even, it's always a little bit of a, this is my gut feeling, this is interesting. Now you go see what the audience thinks about it. And not every person who you think should be, same thing, right? Steven Spielberg doesn't always have a hit. Sometimes he misses. It's not science, it's art. And art is very subjective.
Didn't he just make that show Army of the Dead on Netflix that came out? Was that Steven Spielberg or no?
I think that was Zack Schneider.
Yeah. So was it exec produced by or not? I don't remember.
I don't know. I
don't know either.
But yeah, it's interesting.
I've heard it said that Hollywood, the town, is kind of run by fear, like fear in the sense that, when picking up material and broadcasting material, that there's always this fear of like, it's always, because as you said, it's always kind of a gamble. Because we always hear stories of like how writers and artists are always trying to convince the executives that they know better, and the executives feel like, no, I can push this show in a better direction and make it work, but that's not their job, and that's not what they're trained to do. Does it, in your experience, has it varied from company to company, from executives to executives, on just how much self-awareness they have about the fact that they're not artists in that way?
Well, if you could be a writer, you would be. You can't, so you're telling them how to do it, what they already do. Now, that's not completely true all the time. There are some executives who become writers, which is always very interesting. They finally decided that they couldn't not do it, and they went off and did it themselves, which I think is lovely. I would say however many years ago, there was more difference. A lot of executives now have certainly come out of film programs where they've studied, one hopes they've studied some screenwriting. They don't have to be screenwriters to study the format. And then it's about how instinctively they understand story and character and what makes something engaging to people, and how can they communicate that to someone who has an idea. You can shape and mold something and be a real help. It's almost like people who write novels. We think, oh, they write them all by themselves. Well, no, they have editors at the publishing companies, and editors make lots of changes and they make lots of suggestions. And then, of course, it's up to the writer to take them or not. But if they don't, they generally don't get their book published. So there's a lot of collaboration there too. And so the best executives are people who understand story and either don't want to risk being writers because it's pretty freelancy, take your chances, or they're truly the nurturing type of people that want to pull forward people with talent. And that's the powerful place to do it more so, right? So it's an interesting mix. It's always important, if you're going to pitch to an executive, to look them up, figure out where they came from, where did they study, what is their background. Sometimes they were, in some kind of production previously, or sometimes they came out of Harvard, right? And they just studied with somebody big or whatever that is. So it's important to understand where they're coming from so you can understand the kind of notes that they're giving and the kind of control they want or need to have, or their ability to not need it, to trust you to do what they hired you to do.
When you're pitching a show, like if you're going out, if you have a show and you're going out and you're going to pitch it, do you have that in mind always? Like, okay, I'm going to pitch to HBO. These are the people I'm pitching to. How they react.
Yeah. What do I think they want? What part of this is going to be most interesting to them? Their own personal backgrounds. I mean, you need to know as much of that as possible. Also, so you don't step into any landmines, right? I mean, everyone has a joke about the worst pitch they ever did. And the worst pitch I ever did was for a movie idea. And I went in to meet with someone. And
can you share what the movie idea was by chance?
You know what? I honestly can't even remember anymore.
Okay.
You do so much of this, and whenever you just it's really fun. I don't even remember. I just remember I had this meeting, and first you do a little chit chatting, all right? A little chit chat, general stuff. Who are you, to see if you even like each other, and maybe if this doesn't sell, they'll want you to do something else with them. So you're hoping to make a connection. And in the middle of the chit chatting, I don't know why, but the concept of cheerleading came up, and I said something derogatory about cheerleaders because I certainly wasn't one in high school, and they're easy to pick on, except the woman I was meeting with had been a cheerleader.
Yes.
So right away you're like, oh, I just insulted her. Okay, fine. Keep talking. Let's find a thing we have in common, right? At some point later, smoking came up. And it's generally pretty good to say smoking is stupid. It kills people. Who the hell would waste their money on a pack of cigarettes? She grew up on a tobacco farm in Kentucky.
Oh my God.
No.
I didn't know that. I didn't have the ability to get that kind of information back in the day, right? I was like, oh my God, what am I going to say now, right? I mean, and then finally there was a movie that had come out a while ago now. This is an old meeting, called Indecent Proposal. And it was Woody Harrelson, Demi Moore, and Robert Redford. And the idea was that Robert Redford was a rich man who offered Woody Harrelson and his wife $1 million for his wife to sleep with him for one night. So the couple would get $1 million and she'd have sex with the guy one night. And that was the question of the movie. And my joke when that movie came out had always been, well, there's no question. It's a win-win. I get $1 million and I have sex with Robert Redford. Where's the loss in this, right? The movie made no sense to me. She brought it up, and she wasn't stupid. She brought it up. I said what I always said about the movie, which was that. I said, it needs to be like $1 million and Danny DeVito. And now I have a question, right? Even though I love Danny DeVito, right? I don't mean to be insulting to him. She then was happy to let me know she had been an associate producer on that movie. Her name doesn't appear on the poster. I could not have known that, except my agent should have set me up by giving me some of her background. And he didn't. So that was like 3 strikes, you're out. Bye-bye. Like, we're not ever going to be friends. We're not ever going to go have coffee later, and you're not going to buy anything from me. So I'll leave, right? At least I should have known her movie background. Maybe an agent wasn't going to be able to tell me where she grew up. But yeah, 3 strikes, you're out. That was not a good meeting. So you need to know. You are not going to sell that woman, thank you for not smoking, right? That's not a piece you're going to bring into her office. So it is very important who you're talking to.
Yeah, I guess that just was not meant to be.
No.
This did not sound like it was meant to be at all.
No, it did not. It was not meant to be. It wasn't. Obviously, it wasn't. I don't even remember her name now. But yeah. So.
Is she still working in the industry?
I don't know. I don't remember
no
her
idea.
name.
Yeah.
That's not funny. But it's an interesting thing. You need to know all that you can about who you're talking to, because that's how you're going to figure out what they're interested in.
And if it's like going to be a relationship that you can work with.
Right. Yeah. They don't have to like your story. If they like you, they can bring you in. That's the other thing that happens. If they like you, but they don't buy your story, your pitch, whether it's a TV show or a movie, whatever it is, but they have a book that they've bought the rights to, and they want someone to come in with what is your idea and how this book will work. That's when they'll go, oh, I really like working with you. I really feel a connection to you. Go home and think about this and come back in a couple of weeks and tell me how you would attack this. And maybe you'll get that gig. So that's what you're trying in a meeting if nothing else happens. Or, I ended up doing that Picket Fences episode because I had temped on a show that Jeff Melvoin was an executive, or that time he was a supervising producer. And so we met for like 2 weeks, and he read something of mine and he was impressed, and we stayed in touch. It was 4 years before he got the job where he could hire me. 1 2-week job gave me a script 4 years later. You got to always think about the future of the relationships that you're making, which is also what I say to students, both in internships and within classes. you're not going to call Steven Spielberg and become his best friend to get a job. But somewhere in your group of friends that you're all connecting with right now, one of you is going to go become Steven Spielberg. And that's, you're all then going to stay connected to each other and help each other move up.
That's yeah. As far as networking goes, I think that's probably one of the best pieces of advice you can give to someone. It's like, understand that everything, it's it's the right thing to be nice to people and cultivate relationships, but also it's almost like you're moving up with your generation. Like everyone rises up together.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And you will immediately kick off your, the end of your boot, anybody who you don't want to be around.
That's also true.
Yeah, because they'll just get in your way and they're not going to help you. As long as you're the kind of person who wants to help other people and with their ideas, with, doing writers groups together, reading each other's scripts out loud, going to Q&As in town, and then, talking about the thing you saw afterwards, running into other people at those events, and, hey, let's all get together and have a meetup 2 weeks from now at such and such a pizza place or coffee house or a bar, whatever it is. Building those relationships, because that's, you're the next generation of assistants who are the next generation of writers or executives or whatever people choose to be.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely, you definitely want to see like who is going to be like the big Steven Spielberg of our generation,
There will be.
Yeah, there definitely will be someone. But it's definitely, you also, I think it is really important to just make these connections now, especially even if we don't have that many connections. Like, I don't think I would have ever been on this podcast with Tim if I wouldn't have mentioned during one of our internship meetings, like, oh, like I always wanted to be on a podcast or whatever. And then, he's like, oh yeah, like my initial thought was like he was asking me to come in to just be on one episode, and then he's like, oh, do you want to be co-host? And I was like, hell yeah, I want to be co-host. Like, that's so interesting.
You never know where things will lead, so never try to guess. I think that's important. It's like, don't try to guess where something will lead. Just like start a conversation, start developing relationships, and they will grow and things will evolve from there.
Exactly. Well, that's entirely true. And you can only do as much as you can do. You can only be the contributing member on your half. Then it's up to the other person to do their half as well. And if they don't, then they were never going to be helpful in the first place and you don't need them. Right? So you just keep collecting like-minded people who have similar goals, who are willing to work toward those goals, and who you can see have the same kind of work ethic you have. Sometimes that's one of the most important things that you should share. They're not someone who wants to talk about the script they're going to write. They're somebody who just wrote another one and they want your opinion. And they're in the middle of a third and a fifth and a 10th and whatever that is. That's who you want to be around.
Yes. There's a lot of talkers.
Oh yes.
In this work that we do,
This town is full of people who will tell you the greatest idea they have for a script. And the next time you meet them a month later at a bar, they have the same really great idea. And a year later, they're still talking about the scene they're going to write in the second act in that idea. And you've written 5 scripts.
Yeah. You definitely, especially like in the spec script that I wrote right now for like Queen's Gambit. I remember you I still have it like locked in my mind or in my memory when you said, practice with this script to finish writing it to show to other people. And then, maybe you finish this in 2 months, but then on the next script that you're writing, try and finish it in 1 month. And then, it goes down and then you'll be writing, 5 scripts within that 1 month or something like that. I think it really does. How did you do it? How do you, practice on your schedule? Do you time limit yourself? Do you 1 month or 1 week to do 3 acts or something like that?
Well, you get into a pattern when you do it. I mean, the Writers Guild offers 2 weeks to write a script. That's what, if you're a freelance writer, they have to give you 2 weeks to go home. But when you're on a staff, they expect you to write it in 1 week. They expect you to be able to write 10 to 15 producible pages a day. So that's where you have to get yourself to if you're really going to take it seriously. So yeah, this took 2 months. This takes 1 month, and you get it down to 3 weeks and 2 weeks and the best you can. You have to find the times of day that work for you. Some people are night writers. I am not, but some people can work really great from 10 in the evening till 2 in the morning and then sleep from 3 to 10, right? Okay, then you have to know that. And then you need to build a day job that allows you to do that, right? Because that's when you're going to do the most work. Some people, I go from like 6 a.m. to like 2 p.m. And then I make phone calls and do other kind of email work and stuff like that, because then I sort of run out of my creative excitement or whatever. So I have to make sure that I don't do anything else until later. I don't take meetings or do things like that until later in the day. If you don't do that, when you finally approach your computer to start writing something, it will take you so much longer and it will be so much more frustrating that you won't get to the point you want and you might turn away, right? So you have to be in a comfortable place to do that. And, this town is full of different kinds of jobs you can make work for that, whatever is the time frame that you need. I have a friend who gets up at 4 in the morning and writes until 6 or 7 and then heads off to work at 7:30. She has to be there at 8 at an agency, right? So she's doing an agent thing, but she wants to be a writer. So that's her time. And then the rest of the day, she's busy, and can't possibly consume writing and couldn't do it at night because she's too darn tired from everything she did in the day. But that means she goes to bed at like 9 o'clock at night. So she can get up at 3 in the morning and still have had enough sleep to be ready to do that. That's really disciplined, but you have to be, right? You have to be. When I was the first couple of shows I was on, the new writers always get stuck with the crummy time frames. So somebody always writes over Thanksgiving. So there'll be something to film like the Monday you come back. So there you go. Thanksgiving Day, all your friends, your family's all having dinner at the table and you're in a different room in the house, working your ass off to write something in 5 days that'll be ready to produce. Or over summer, some shows do, some shows don't, or Christmas break. Yeah, it's like, well, then I get this many days to do it. That's all I'm going to do is sit in front of this thing and just, you can't stop because you're not allowed to. Now, I have another friend who teaches a thing called speed drafting. So then you figure out what's your best way to work. And his idea is that you should set a little timer, hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever you think, and just keep going. And if you have a problem, I need to research something, you just slug in a little thing, figure this out later, that sort of thing. Keep moving, keep moving. And the next day, you don't go back and look at what you did the day before. You just take it from where you stopped and go. So you have a whole first draft as fast as possible. And then you take the time to pick your way through and do the rewriting and fill in the stuff that you didn't know along the way. That works for him. That gives him 2 hours a day of writing, and that's all he needs to get to a project. And then it's 2 hours of rewriting when he gets to that stage. So you find a process that works for you, and then you make sure your lifestyle allows for that process.
Mm-hmm.
I think this might be a good place to transition to because you're not just a professional, you teach, and obviously teaching is, I think in many ways I would assume teaching even makes you a better writer because you're forced to think about writing in that way so often. I guess I'll ask, why did you also want to teach?
My first job was as a high school teacher, because I come from Ohio, college in Ohio, and there was no way you were going to convince your parents or anybody that like it was legitimate to think you'd get a job in television. So you had to get a degree in something real. So it was in high school, and I taught literature and things like that for a couple of years until I could make the move to California. And I could make it because you could teach in Ohio, you could teach here. So I could get a long distance job as a teacher, which gave me a financial way to make a move like that. So I actually liked it. I missed it in a weird way. I mean, it certainly doesn't pay as much as TV, but there's a lot of things you do as a teacher. There are skills you have, and a lot of that translates into writing and pitching, because pitching is like I'm giving a lecture and explaining an idea to you to make you love it so much you'll pay me to do it. So that's a skill. That little performance thing comes from a teaching background. And I also think that television, particularly because was free, and even if your parents are paying for it, essentially is free, as opposed to movies you have to fork over $20 to go see them. So television is like this giant podium that a teacher would stand at and lecture. And a TV show and a movie, any piece of writing that's good, that sticks to you, has a message, is there with a theme about how you want other people to live their lives, a lesson that you wish other people would learn. So really, writing is like being a teacher on steroids. But I miss part of it, right? And you do miss trying to explain to people how it should be done, because you can't really do that on a TV show. Maybe if you're the showrunner, but even then, you're hiring people that already know how to do it, and they don't want you to tell them how. They may listen to you and like roll their eyes because they have to, because you're paying the money, but that's not the same world, right? And I also think there wasn't a lot of focus on women in this business for a long time. And so I thought that was something that I could bring to a classroom, was to really bring forward more young women who would be ready to tackle this business and really have a true understanding of it, so they'd know what to expect and sort of how to work around some of the bullshit and, you know, be good enough not to fall into any traps. So I just thought it would be, you know, and I live in LA, and TV comes and goes. You don't always know when the next show will sell or when you'll get staffed on something. So good back, you know, it's always a good background of, I'll just do this for a while and move and, you know, change around. So lots of people in town actually teach at some of the various schools, because of course we're in LA, so there's tons of schools that have film programs and screenwriting programs and all that stuff. So you get a lot of that blend. Now, I really love the fact that in Europe, they're more structured around what I would call a scholar artist, because they get grants to make their films. So a lot of filmmakers are teachers at major universities, and then they make movies and they get the money from the government to make the movies. We don't quite do that here.
Wow.
But we're seeing a little more of that, certainly on the film festival circuit and stuff like that. Or, you know, for instance, Kevin Wilmot, who got the Oscar for co-writing Black Klansman with Spike Lee. He's a full-time professor at Kansas University. That's what he does. He doesn't want to live in LA or New York. He wants to write movies, and he met Spike Lee at a film festival, and they each had a movie up at the film festival early on in both their careers. And they decided they liked each other. Speaking of networking, they started to collaborate. And, you know, 2 years ago, he won an Oscar. And he went back, he flew back to Kansas the next day and put his Oscar on the lectern in front of his classroom and started talking.
That's so funny.
Best of both worlds. That's my idea of the best of both worlds. So
that is because you don't, I think in many ways you think of this business as an all or nothing business. You give all of it to, which I mean is alluring to some people. It's like, oh, now my life is completely this. That's awesome. But some people do desire that, to not always be in the trenches, as I would say, all the time. And I guess teaching allows you to stay within that headspace, but it's a different muscle.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Because you obviously you teach writing, and what is something that you always like what do you think are like the principles of good television writing that you try to teach your students? What's the things you want them to get from your classes?
Well, I want them to think that whatever they're writing is a message. So I think they should start with a theme. What is a message you want to put out in the world? And what's a story that is like the metaphor, or that's the parable that will tell that idea, plant that idea in people's minds? I think you have your own life philosophy. I don't care how old you are. You don't have to be old or young to have it, right? You have some ideas, and those make everything stronger. The stuff you really like is because you really agreed with what was being said about how to live or how to treat other people, right? And so you really have to think about those things, and that's going to make whatever you do richer. So I like to start from a place of theme. And of course, then TV is all about characters, because I need someone I'm going to want to come and meet over and over again, either 20 hours in a row or 20 weeks in a row, however I choose to do that. So I need to find someone that I can connect with. And I think that's something that in the movies, you know, you can do a lot of explosions, fun stuff, tentpole movies and all that. Although I suppose my son would say Transformers were characters he really cared to watch, right? But they're a little different than, you know, the kind of people you'd see, let's say, in Grey's Anatomy, speaking of Shonda Rhimes. When Netflix first really started running and doing a lot of reruns and stuff like that. And I think it's still true. Grey's Anatomy tends to fall on the top of the viewing of Netflix, because people fell in love with those characters. They want to see them succeed. They want to watch people. A character that's interesting is someone who wants to be better at what they do for interesting reasons. Walter White wanted to be better at what he did for interesting. There were bad reasons, but they were interesting. Right? The Grey's Anatomy doctors want to be the best doctors, whether it's because they have a competitive streak and they have to be better than everybody else, which is kind of a bad reason put to a good use, right? Or because in that case, Meredith Grey was trying to live up to the reputation of her mother. And that's something you'll probably never do because she was a groundbreaking person. So then she had the confidence issue and all that, which made us love her, even though she could be a real pain in the butt sometimes.
Yeah.
So you have to have a character who is moving toward learning something that you would like other people to learn. I think if you start there, you will invent something interesting.
I think for me, my favorite exercise that you did was like the first one that we did when like the first day of class, and it was we had to write like a story about shoes.
The story of your shoes.
Yeah, and then I think it really brings out. I was like really interested as to why, but then after you explained it, you said it gives me an idea as to who you are as a person. And then I think that's also really important as to who you are as a person. It really brings out into your writing, or like, you put your personality into your own writing as well.
Exactly. You can only really tell the world from your perspective. And that's the only thing you have different. You can learn all the structure and all the rules about writing. You can be really good with dialogue and all those things. The only thing that makes you different is you have a way that you look at the world. And your characters are going to see the world that way. And that's interesting. That's what we haven't seen yet, right? That's what you can bring to the table. And I think that really, the shoe thing, that's the trick of it. Everyone thinks, what am I writing about my shoes? But really, you're telling me the story of who you are.
So is the exercise you literally describing your shoes and like what kind of person would wear such a shoe? Like
you don't want too tight a prompt. It's literally tell me the story of your shoes. Some people will tell it from the point of view of the shoes, as if they picked the person. Some people will talk about the shoes because I had a guy in a different class once. He was wearing a pair of shoes. I forget the style even now, but they were the same style his father had worn. And his father left when he was like 10. And he realized he was still trying to become the person that he didn't know. And that's where he picked those shoes from. So we learned all about the baggage he's carrying, right? And the message he's really got for the world is being a father is a really important job. Don't screw it up, right? I want people to really think about the obligation they've made when they have a kid. So he was all wrapped up in that as a theme in the body of work that he put together. Yeah, you never know. Some people make it funny and they go, oh, so you're the comic, right? Everything's funny to you. Even shoes can be funny because your perspective is looking at the world with that warped, funny sense of humor. You just accidentally, your personality comes out in however you write it.
I remember I did mine based on a day I had with my friends on a Sunday. But I also made it, interesting in the terms that it was like, the shoes were experiencing, like their own thing. Because I obviously wouldn't buy, how to be a better shoe for dummies. But,
Exactly.
yeah. So, but it's like, you kind of have to, I like mixing sometimes, like, obviously like the fantasy of the shoe, but actually like, incorporating it into a day that I had with my friends that I went out.
So that tells me all about you, right? That friendship means something to you. So think about all the TV shows built around, hello, friends. And the importance of friends. And if you look back at TV history, most earlier comics and all the way up really through for a long time, even the 90s, shows were built around families. And then we have kids flying farther away to college and all of that, and then getting a job in another state, which really wasn't a normal thing for a long time. People might have gone away to college, they'd come home and find a job in their hometown. But now we have more of this stay away, farther away. So your friends become your family. And learning how to make a friend family, to be a group that always want to be together like that, that was a new lifestyle. And so the message of how do you be a good friend, hello, that's behind a ton of TV shows, right? So that's the theme that somebody like you would be working with, and you discover it that way.
Because I feel like even now, like I experience it in my own friend group as well. Most of my friends, they came from out of the country to study in the United States in Chicago.
Fascinating.
It is the same but different for me, because I mean my parents were only like 30 minutes, 15 minutes away by train. in the suburbs, but I was still living in the city for college, and so was my sister. So it was, who would be the people that I see most often? It would be like my close friends, and then maybe I would see my parents like once a month or like twice a month or something like that,
Well, you
And then
just
I
hit
would
on
be-
something else that we haven't seen on TV. Your generation has been exposed to more people from other countries than the generation before you. Everybody on Friends was all from the same friggin' city. And forget the
Yep.
fact that they were all white, and that's still an issue that nobody wants to talk about on Friends, right? They were in New York City and every night. Imagine that. I've not seen a TV show that is built around a group of college friends where 3 of them come from different countries. But clearly that's an experience you have that hasn't been reflected.
I'm gonna write that down really quick.
There you go. It's a new.
That's very true. It's very true. You don't see that. I don't know if you would call that like nativism. Like we kind of expect shows like characters to kind of be from the same place and have, because that means that there's some similarities between them in that way.
Right. But if you're all in college, the similarities, you've all chosen to study this thing together.
Right. And there's a bunch of international students now, more than ever before. I mean,
exactly.
I think it'd be weird to go to a college, especially in an urban setting, and have everybody be from the United States. I don't think that even happens anymore.
Exactly. But I haven't seen it reflected. So there's something new for you guys to chew on.
There you go.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Well, we just, Danielle, I think you have a new show now. I think you have the premise for
give me maybe 2 or 5 years, and then you'll probably see it on, I don't know, HBO.
There you go.
We called it right here on the podcast.
Right now.
Here. We're calling it. It's done. It's in stone. It's written in stone.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh. What do you think, Roseanne, is something that, because I'm always interested learning from the teacher's perspective. What's like mistakes that you see in young writers' scripts that are like most common? Like just an aspect of writing that a lot of young writers don't get or have trouble with at first.
There's probably a couple of things. I see sometimes that people don't take the time to do the research they need into the world they want to write about. It's really not good to come into class with a first act, let's say, or an outline. And if I want to ask you a question about how doctors would really do that, and you say, I haven't looked into it yet. Don't write it until you've looked into it. I've had people write cop shows where cops do things you can't do. It doesn't work that way, right? Oh, well, I didn't know that. Well, you're writing a cop show. Go figure out what happens the day after they shoot somebody. They don't just go back to their desk. There's all kinds of stuff that happens. I'm trying to think. I've always had examples of that, or people who do different things, or they have doctors do different things. I'm like, that's not how a hospital works. Didn't you pay attention to that? Have you ever been to a hospital? You can't do that. You must know. You must be the expert in the room when you have brought in a story about a certain time or place. I laughed because I had someone once who was writing a piece that took place in the 70s. And she had the parents strap their child into the car seat before putting them in the car. And I stopped and I said, did you research the history of car seats? Do you know that they didn't start until the mid 80s? In the 70s, you strapped your kid into a seatbelt, if you bothered with that at all, because not all cars had seatbelts. She had no idea. She thought since there had been car seats since her childhood, they had always existed. And I was like, I now know that you didn't do your homework. I'm not going to hire a writer onto my show who didn't take the time to look into the period they were writing about. So you got to do your research. I think that's probably the biggest mistake I see. And then the second biggest, and many people will tell you this, and it's not just in classes, but in what you read as, doing readership at all over town, never write something that looks like I've seen it before. Because why do I need you? I need to see something that's different. And that's where your personal perspective comes from, right? I need to see something I haven't seen before. And that doesn't mean it has to be edgier and worse and mean and nasty. But there's an honesty to it that I didn't expect. That's what I want to see.
And that's perspective. Perspective gives you that.
Exactly.
I feel like I've learned so much today. This conversation.
Me too.
There you go. Then
what do you think? I mean, what is your biggest piece of advice to not just writers, but to filmmakers who are coming up today? Like, what's your biggest advice on how to like navigate this journey that they're going to go on? And I guess, how are they going to continue to grow? Like, as you said, it's not just about growing your career, it's about growing yourself as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that while you're maintaining yourself, whether it be out in LA or New York or Chicago or wherever?
You have to stay curious. You always have to want to know more. Being a lifelong learner, and that's true in almost anything in the world, but largely in art, because things are always changing. New stories are always presenting themselves. So you always want to be the curious person who wants to know why, right?
Mhm.
That's going to keep you fresh. That's going to keep you interested in new and different things, and a variety of things. I think that's the biggest thing, being curious.
Remaining curious.
Always want to know more. Ask why all the time. Why'd they do that? Why did it happen that way? What would have happened if somebody else had been in charge of that?
What would have happened if these certain characters came together and did this?
Exactly.
And one
What
character.
if? Yep. What if is the best question ever. What if this happened to me? How would I behave?
I mean, what if is where all stories come from, really? Like,
It
it's
is.
what if we do this? What if
It is.
what if you had a person like this who feels this way about the world, and then they're put into this situation, and how do you get out of that?
That's what makes it fun, because then you have to go figure it out.
Yeah. Well, Rosanne, I want to thank you for coming on to the podcast. I want to thank Daniela for getting you on the podcast. And this I had a really fun time doing this. I hope both of you enjoyed this as much as I did.
Writers love conversations. That's how you know people are writers. If they can't talk, they're not really writers.
Yeah.
So it's always lovely to talk to people who are very interested in writing. So thank you for inviting me.
No,
Of
thank you
course.
so much for coming on.
It only seemed fitting. So
Yeah, I mean, it only seemed right.
other than like, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. I mean, the semester with you was a really amazing semester. I feel like I really learned a lot. And even now, I feel like I learned something new today as well.
Hey.
But yeah, I was excited when you said yes. I didn't know if like your schedule was super busy, but because it's kind of hard to get people that are, other than like they're the professors or something like that. I know that teachers have lives. So,
Teachers have lives.
Have a life. Be curious and have a life, because your stories come from your life. And you're right. Well, I had a barbecue yesterday, a barbecue tomorrow. Happened to be home today, so it worked.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Well,
perfect.
Everyone should. I mean, it's Memorial Day, right? Isn't today Memorial Day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow's
Tomorrow.
Sorry. Tomorrow's Memorial Day. Well, have a great Memorial Day, guys.
There you go.
You
Thank
too.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Out.
Thank you.